Hello everyone, welcome back. My name is Robin Ferrand. I'm a filmmaker and photographer based on Vancouver Island in British Columbia. And today it's all about the DEHANCE'R's film emulation plugin for DaVinci Resolve and how to use it. So for those of you that don't know, DEHANCE'R's is one of the best film emulation plugins out there. It allows you to transform any piece of video and make it as it was shot on film. It's available for DaVinci Resolve, Final Cut Pro, and Premiere Pro. And I've already made a review of DEHANCE'R that you can view with the link above, where I share my thoughts about the plugin, the good, the bad, and who is it for. And for today's video, I thought I would show you how I grade some of those clips, because DEHANCE'R is quite the powerhouse, and it can be a bit overwhelming, especially when opening the plugin for the first time. I should also note that I'm not a professional colorist, but I do have a good understanding of colors. I would also recommend to read the PDF attached with your DEHANCE'R trial. They're explaining quite well all of the tools, what they do, and how to use them. And I read it entirely even before launching the app, because it's quite useful. One big advantage of Resolve is color management, and DEHANCE'R can take advantage of all the different color science and allow users to grade in several color spaces such as the DaVinci Wide Gamut, Access, Cinnamon, and of course the standard Rec 709. I use DaVinci Wide Gamut, but I'll also show you how to use the DEHANCE'R with the Rec 709 space, because it gives the user abilities to use the built-in camera profiles made by DEHANCE'R. And we are now in DaVinci Resolve. As you can see, I'm already inside the color panel. But before we start grading, we need to talk about color spaces. The great thing about DaVinci Resolve is that there are a couple of color spaces you can use depending on your need. And when working with DEHANCE'R, it's compatible with some of those color spaces. The first thing is to bring our project settings with Shift 9. And we're going to go under color management. And this is this first window we're interested in to change a couple of those settings. So the color science is going to stay the same, which is DaVinci YRGB. But then in the timeline color space, you're going to go here and you're going to change to DaVinci WG Intermediate. And then for the output color space, we're going to choose Rec 709A. Now I'm using A because I'm on the Mac, and I'm going to export that timeline in ProRes with QuickTime, and using the A compared to the standard Rec 709s kind of correct that problem we have with a contrast shift. And when I click Save, okay. So now we are working in the a broader color space, which is the DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate. We are now ready to build our node tree. As you can see, you have your first node here, but I'm not going to touch this at the moment. Instead, I'm going to go into my still here, and I'm going to click Apply Grade. So this is not a feature by default. I actually created that node tree and then use the still features to kind of like use it as a preset. So every single time I don't have to rebuild my tree. Now let's explore what's inside my node tree here. So first thing is a color space transform, fitting inside a white balance node, a saturation node, 3 masks. So if I need to make a gradient for the sky, another mask for my subject. It's then fitting inside DEHANCE'R, which is deactivated at the moment. And then we have our last color space transform output, which is a Rec 709. Now, if you want to bypass the input CST and output CST, you can go back to your project setting with Shift 9, and in the DaVinci YRGB, you can choose Color Manage. That means that depending on what camera you use, DaVinci should be able to recognize which camera and already apply the CST by himself, especially if you're using a Blackmagic, for example. It will be the same with my R5C, since it does also have the XF AVC codec and it has the XML file. The reason why I'm not using Color Manage though is that I do a round trip between Final Cut and DaVinci Resolve, and when I do those, it's unable to recognize the camera. So instead I'm just building this CST. So it's really up to you at this point, but just to make sure, I would recommend to use a CST as an input and an output. Now let's see what's inside my CST here. So I'm going to click on the first one, I'm going to click on Effect. Okay, so this was shot on R5C, a Canon R5C. So the input color space is Cinema Gamut, and the input gamma is Canon Silux 3, and those correspond to the setting I had in my camera. And it's going to output it as a DaVinci Wide Gamut and DaVinci Intermediates, which corresponds to the color pipeline we're currently working in. And then over here, that's our output CST. We are taking that, which is in DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate, and now we need to bring it back to Rec 709. So here input is DaVinci Intermediate, and then under output color space, it's Rec 709 because that was standard definition, and my output gamma is the standard gamma 2.4. Now watch if I deactivate this, and I deactivate this. So now here, like, because there is no CST, I'm actually seeing the log images straight from the Canon R5C. And if you take a look at the scope here, you can see that we're already losing some detail here, which is normal because there's the C-Log3. But watch if I turn on the first CST. See how it compressed the images even further down, so it makes the images flatter, and while it doesn't regain any more dynamic range, the color pipeline has a broader spectrum, so it allows you to work with the file in a different way than using a standard Rec 709 with a LUT. And then if I turn on this Rec 709, which is, like you may have understood by now, that's technically my transform log. So if I turn it on, here my image is back to Rec 709, but the Rec 709 from the DaVinci Intermediate. So again, it's going to be different if you're using a standard Rec 709 timeline. And that way I found that, especially when working with a C-Log3, which isn't as flat as C-Log2, I'm able to retain much more details, especially in the highlights, and that's one of the reasons I really enjoy that color space inside DaVinci Resolve. As mentioned before, my DEHANCER is deactivated at the moment because I want to work on my color corrections before even I think about creating it. So the color space transform did most of the work by bringing the images to a Rec 709, but then that's why I have this note here. First place is this my WB for my white balance, and the first thing I want to do is color correct and make sure that my white balance is adequate. So there are a couple of ways of doing this. The first one would be to use the level. So if you click here, and inside your gain here, you can change the amounts of the red channels, the green and the blue to color your image. So I use that, but always try first that tool here, which is the white balance tool, and it brings a pipette, and then you can look at the value on the screens and see what's happening. So by hovering over the images, I can see that most of the time my channels of greens is higher than the two others, and that kind of makes sense because it was shot in the green area, right? But so what you can do actually is that you can think of trying to look for a zone here that's kind of neutral, like the grass here, and by clicking on it, it's gonna do some sort of like a change here. As you can see, my temperature was dropped, and I added some tint towards the magenta to color correct the images. So if I toggle this on and off, and you take a look at my scope here, take a look at what it did. So it kind of lowered my green channel and compensate with the red and the blue. So already here you can see that this is much better and it's much more accurate in terms of like colors. Now you also want to make sure that your skin tones are in check. So you can switch here to parade. We're going to go to vector scope. And then if you don't have those settings on, you want to make sure that additional gamut, you want to show the 2x zoom to see a better zoom here, and then also show the skin indicator. And here what I often do is that I'm going to make a mask. So let's make a small mask like this, and I want to make sure that I'm like roughly only on the skin tone here. So it's going to be a very small zone to work with, but it should still work. And then on top here, I'm going to click highlights. So now I'm only seeing here in the vector scope the skin tone, and you can see it's very difficult to see here because it's only so small, but you can see that my dot here is aligned with that line here that represents the skin tone. It means that my skin tones are in check. So I'm going to remove this and remove this. There you go. Okay, so now my image is color balanced. So the next thing here is the saturations. And you could still like bring some contrast inside the Rec 709, but there's plenty of way of working with contrast in DEHANCER. So the next step is going to go back to our parade here, and we're going to turn on DEHANCER. So already you see there's a big chance by just dragging DEHANCER, and I've already changed some of those settings in my DEHANCER'S to build inside my node tree, so it might be different on yours. But first thing first, in the input, you want to make sure that the source is 2D VR wide gamut intermediate for DaVinci Resolve, wide gamut intermediates. So it corresponds again to the pipeline that we've set prior. And here you have your standard settings, so you have your exposure compensations, temperature compensation, tint, difference, and so on. So generally, I would always recommend these three settings to do them prior to use DEHANCER and do previous node, because DaVinci Resolve will have a better way of doing it. However, I always have the difference enables because it's going to be useful for a couple of the tools we're going to use in DEHANCER. And then by default, you have the profile codec Vision 3 250D. And by default, you should also see here on your images that you have the grain enable. Now, I disable it on mine because the film grain is an algorithm. It's not simply a film a grain overlay like maybe other film emulations. So it takes a lot of resources. And I found that trying to grade a timeline with the film grain on each clip is very difficult to have a smooth grading workflow. So it's always deactivated. And a couple of those tools are better to use on a timeline node, since the grain and a couple of those tools, just film damage, film breath, gate weave, will be more of a global effect for the whole project. As you can see, by default, the selected film is CodeCVision 250D. And by clicking on it, you can choose a different film stock. So you have like photographic films, you have Kodak motion picture films, and as well Fujifilm Eternal Line, which is expired now. But we're going to stick to the Vision 3 250D because it's one of the most popular film stock out there. And one thing is important here is that some of those films will work better depending on the situations. And there is a graph on the website by DEHANCER where they really explain how to use some of the stocks. For example, 50D should be used in daylight when there is lots of daylight. Then 250D should be used when there is less light, or in indoor environments when you have a good light coming from a window, for example. And then if you're walking indoor in a studio with lots of tungsten fixture, then you would swap to the 200T for tungsten or the 500T, which is also tungsten. Here we are walking inside kind of a shades here. It was the end of the day, and by just switching between the 50D and the 250D, you can already see how much more contrast the 250D has. So it's really going to depend on your preferences. And regardless if you choose 50D or 250D, you can see that both films have a relatively low contrast and very mild saturations. And that's not a bug. That's actually one of the characteristics of the Vision 3 line is to make very flat film negatives. So it allows colorists to really dial in the looks they seek for each of the projects. So it's great to have kind of that flat profile. So after with all of those settings, you can really again dial in the look you seek, and we'll be able to gain back that saturation. So there is no worry about that, and it's not a bug. But it can be a bit jarring at first, especially when you turn on DEHANCER, and it's kind of like this very bluish image here, and it's not really pleasing. But we'll fix that, no worries. Under film, there's another slider, which is the push and pull EV, and watch what happens when I drag it. Not only it changed the exposure, but it also introduced a color shift. And this is it was based on the actual process of pushing and pulling film, which, to keep things simple, it's if you have a roll of Kodak Portra 400 and you need to shoot into a darker environment, you're going to tell your camera that this Portra 400 is actually 800 ISO. So you're underdeveloping the film and you are able to get an extra stop of light. And then during the development process, you are going to leave the film inside the developing tank for longer to compensate for that underexposure and to regain that one stop of light. And that's what pushing the film is. But by pushing the film, you also change the contrast because it's in developing tank for longer, and will also introduce some sort of color shift. And that's one of the reasons why it's quite obvious these days, is because some photographers really enjoy the look of some negative film that are pushed. And pull is the opposite thing. You will overexpose the film and develop it for less time in the developing tank, and that's going to overall reduce the contrast. And now that we've selected our film negative stock, which is Kodak Vision 3 250D, we're going to go down here to print, and you can see by default I have by profile set to Kodak 2383 print film, and it's enabled. By default it may be disabled on yours, and you can see the difference it makes. And these settings here emulates what your film negative stock would look like once printed on a film print, because you really have to think of a film as a two-step process. First, you have your film negative stock, which you are putting inside the camera to capture your image. Then you would develop it, and when it's developed, you need to put it onto something. So then you would print it onto a different reel that you could then send to movie theaters to be viewed, for example. And you can see on the profile here, you have different type of profile. You have the Kodak, you have the Fujifilm, you have the CANON, and then the Kodak indirect glossy papers. And those are to be used with the different film stock available inside the film here. And to keep things simple, whenever you are using the Kodak Vision 3, you should use the Kodak print film 2383, so it corresponds to an actual workflow of working with film in the current cinema industry. But if you were to use one of the Fujifilm motion pictures, which is the line of Eterna, which is above here, I believe, yes, it's here, then you would print to most likely to Fujifilm. And if you were to use any type of the photographic film paper, you would use the Kodak indirect glossy papers to replicate a type of paper. You would enlarge your negative onto a piece of paper. But you are more than welcome to experiment and trying different profile with different print profiles. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my Kodak 250D here. And that's why I really enjoyed DEHANCER Pro, is that they were able to really replicate that film analog workflow inside a software. But let's move on. Still in print, we're going to enable analog range limiters and watch what happened. It even lowered the contrast even further. And you can think of it as the same tool as using a curve. If you were to drop your highlight a little bit and lift your shadows to fade in those shadows here. So it does basically the same thing, but in a more controlled space. So I'm going to click it back. Next, we're going to go up and we're going to open Film Developer. I'm going to enable it, and here we're going to start working on our contrast. So I'm going to drag it up and start adding contrast. Okay, gamma corrections correspond to your midtones, so I can just lift them or make them darker. Okay, but if your control boost is off, this will have no effect. Okay, so this is really a corrections for the one above. So I'm going to go click back here, maybe here, because we're like under the shades. Color separations is the color separation of the different colors is already set to 100%. I usually leave this as is. And then you have here the color boost, which is also very important to regain back some of that saturation. So I'm going to boost it. And as you can see, we're bringing back some colors, but I really have to push it to make it look like saturated, right? So I don't want it to be at 100%, so I'm going to go down here, around 50, and then I'm going to go to my saturations here to add more saturation. So that saturation is not simply using the saturation below. Instead, what I did is that under color space here, I chose the hue saturation luminosity, and under channels, I deactivated the hue and the luminosity, leaving only the saturation. So now I can use my wheel here in my gains to simply add saturations and not touching the rest. So you can see if I really push it or decrease the saturations, it only affects the saturations. So I'm gonna go around here. Okay, let's go back to DEHANCER. So now that we have our film developers, I think those tools are good for now, so we can just remove them. And the next step would be to go to film compression. It's one of my favorite tools, and one of the reasons why I actually wanted to have a DEHANCER Pro. So I'm going to enable it and look what happened here in the highlights. So it really compressed them, and it makes them look less like digital highlights in a way. And while it cannot regain dynamic range or expand dynamic range, it works in a way that really make a much smoother transitions between tones and new highlights the way film does, because film has a much larger dynamic range towards highlights than digital sensor, especially with a smaller mirrorless camera such as the R5C. And the two sliders to use the most here are tonal range and impact. So tonal range corresponds to how much you're going to touch those highlights, see, so here is way over the top, and it really compressed them, but it doesn't remove the luminosity, except if you're going all the way, obviously. But let's drag it down, and then white point correspond to white point. I usually leave this as is, and same with the color density. But impact kind of like work like a luminosity mask in a way, where it just you tell how much you want those highlights to be impacted by the compressions. So by default it was 60, and you can touch this if you want less of those highlights, but usually 60 is a good thing. Next, we're going to go back to our print, and we're going to work again with that tonal contrast and that color density. So I'm going to add more contrast here. And as you can see, I'm crushing those black, but no worries, we're going to fix those later. Here you have the color density sliders, which correspond to how deep your color will be. So watch what happened to the shirt when I drag the sliders. So to the right, it makes that blue much, much deeper. And then like here, it's over the top. And if I go the other way, it's just make it lighter. And that corresponds roughly to your luminosity inside the HSL. So I'm gonna go around 25 here. Now that we've added a lot of contrast, you can see that we're crushing the black, which is not good. But that brings us to our next tool, which is the expand tool here. This is the tool you're going to use the most throughout your grading process. And so first we have the black point here, and I'm going to reduce it to lift those black and bring back some definitions inside those shadows. Okay, and the white point here works the other way. So by having a negative values, you are actually bringing up your white point here. And you can see that I'm like crushing those highlights here, so I cannot go too far. And if you go above 100, it's doing the opposite, but I wouldn't recommend using anything above 100. But I'm still going to bring back some of those there. Okay. Maybe not so much around here. Okay. And now again, at this point, it's really going back between all of those tools and dialing in the images you want. So here in film compressions, I'm going to increase the tonal range to bring back some of that sky here. And I'm gonna try to impact as well a bit more of it. Okay, and now I kind of have this kind of like faded look, which I don't really like, so I need to bring back maybe more of those black here. So once again, just go back between your print, your expand tool, and your film developer here to really bring back that contrast without losing too much details inside your highlights and your shadows here, okay? So those three tools will really impact your overall contrast. There's only so much I can do within the DEHANCER, and that's why I have some of those masks here. So here, for example, my highlights are still like blown out, so I'm going to use a local mask to trying to retain some of those highlights. So I'm gonna reduce it, change the aspect here, increase the feather, okay, and trying to really work on that patch of sky here. Then I'm going to go to tracking, and I'm going to track it. Okay, wonderful. And next here, I'm going to use those the primary color wheels here, and I'm going to try to retain some of those highlights. And I constantly go back and forth to see what I'm doing, so that the viewer intention isn't drawn too much to that white point here. Next, I'm going to use another mask here, and I'm going this time make it on my subject here. Okay, increase the feathering, and again, I'm going to track it. Let's go. Wonderful. Okay, and now here again, I'm going to increase my gamma a little bit, and maybe as well as my gain, just slightly. And I'm going to toggle back enough to see what I'm doing. So I think I'm going too much here, so I'm going to reduce here. Okay, 1. So at this point, I'm back in the DEHANCER, and I can see the image is still quite blue and cool. So the next tool is going to be our color head, which corresponds to kind of like your split toning or color grading tool, except it's not, and it's based on the color head you would find on a color enlarger. Once you want to print your negative, you would use the three color head here to balance the colors inside your print. So you have the Y, magenta, cyan, but because it's a digital workflow, they kind of combine them with the blue, green, and red channel, you know. So I'm going to enable it, And I'm going to first of all preserve exposure. I'm going to drag this to 0, which I'll explain in a second. And now I'm going to start trying to bring back some of that warmth inside the shadows, and it's all about compensating, okay? So now you can, if you want, go here and then go green if you want, but you're really gonna have like those weird details that you would on split toning. So it's really about compensating, like I said. Okay, maybe some cyan here. Okay, now that we have selected our colors, we're going to apply it to our tones. So first is the shadow. So if I want to cool them, which correspond to this, I'm going to bring in negative values, but if I want to warm them up, I'm going to rotate to the right. Same, I want then to warm up my midtones, which correspond to the skin tones here a little bit. And then you have your highlight tones if you want to apply as well a shift of the colors inside your highlights, which here you can see corresponds to the sky here mostly. So here, and keep an eye on your scope here. Okay, and we come to our preserved exposure. So I set to 0, by default it's set to 100. And this is, if you want this tool to work simply as a split toning tool, then you would drag it to 100%. So it doesn't touch the exposure. But I like those color head also change my exposure here, and that's why it's set to 0. So there's going to be a matter of preferences. But as you can see again here, touching my color head, I've kind of like crushing again those blacks. So I'm going to go back to my expand here and trying to bring it back again there. And again, you can just disable it and enable it to see what you've done. Okay. At this point, we work on most of our colors and our contrasts, and here we're going to come on the finishing touches. So you have your film grain, the halations, the bloom, the film damage, the film breast, and the gate weave, and the vignette. Now, most of those tools takes a lot of resource of your computers, and if you apply each of those tools to each of those clips, it's going to make it difficult to create. It's going to slow down your computers, you're going to drop frames, so it's not ideal. So what I've done is generally, if this would be the timeline from the same project, most likely I would have the same grain for the whole project, and I would have the same film damage, film breast, and gate weave, because those would happen generally at the end of the pipeline. But when it comes to the halations and the bloom, those would be set per clip. But for this example, I'm going to use those tools on each clip so you can see what happens. And start with our film grain here. I'm going to enable it, and you can see in the scope how we can like fill it and make it thicker because it adds the texture. And here you have different profiles that replicate the size of your film. You have 8mm, 16, 35, and 65. By default, I usually use the 35mm here. We were shooting on, I'll go back here, on Kodak Vision 250D, which correspond to the ISO, okay? So I'm going to go back here and I'm going to go to 250D. Now, if I chose Kodak Vision 350D, I would use 50, and if I were using the 500T, I would use the 500. But let's say that if you use that push that I explained earlier, which is here, and you would push to one stop, this means that from 250 you would push it to 500, and then you could use the 35 500s, which correspond to the push grain because there is more grain. But again, you're more than welcome just to use whatever one you want. I'm going to go back to 35mm 250D. And now it's enabled, and you can see the grain here, okay? So if I enable it, so as you can see, it's a really nice grain, and it also removes some of the sharpness because grain isn't, the grain is not as sharp. But let's say that you don't want to lose so much sharpness, well, you're more than welcome to go back up top here to custom, and now you can change that preset of film grain. So you have the size, you have the amount, and if you want more sharpness, you can go to film resolution here and set to 75. So if I drag it all the way down, it really makes it soft, okay? But if I want to retain all the sharpness of the lens, I can go back to 100. So it's going to be a preference. So I'm going to leave that at 75. And again, you can change how much grain there is in your shadows, in your midtones, in your highlights. This I would just change once you get a better hang of the answers and know a little bit more about how film grain works. And but as a default, I would like just stick to the profile, okay? The next tool is Halation, and it's another one of my favorite tools within DEHANCER Pro. And if you don't know what Halation is, I would strongly suggest to take a look at a video made by Film Convert Nitrate. It's another film developer that make film emulation software, and they made this excellent video explaining what Halation is. I'm going to enable Halations and watch closely what happened in my scope on my red channels highlights. You see how it raises it? And now if you look inside the viewer, and pay attention to that source here of orange here. So this is on and off. You can see how it warms up the images, highlights a little bit, and you can't really see the halo, but you can see the warmth of halations. The next tool is the bloom, which you might know if you are using any type of Tiffen Pro Mist or Moment bloom filters. They reduce the overall contrast and kind of diffuse the light around the highlights here. So I'm going to enable it here. As you can see, it's really subtle, but it kind of like lifts those, the contrast in the dark area here and diffuse the light around that bright source here in the sky. So it's a very diffuse effect, which I like. But again, it's another tool that really brings back that kind of shot on film look. The next tool is called Film Damage, and it replicates any type of dust, hair and scratches you would find on film when being handled too much. If you watch old movies, you may find that a lot. It's not as common on newer movies because the process of developing film is much more precise. So even here in Film Damage, when I enable it, you're not going to see much of a difference here. It's going to be very subtle, which is great with all of the DEHANCER tools that are subtle. But if you want to go all in, you can switch back to 8mm. And here you can see here, for example, if I zoom in here, you see here that line here. And the great thing about DEHANCER again is that it's not simply an overlay. So if I turn this off, it's going to remove it. And if I turn it back on, it put it somewhere else. So it's never just a simple overlay. See, you can see here on top here, you can see some speck here of dust, you can see most likely a hair here. And so those are great because they'll most likely move to each shot, and it's going to replicate footage to a shot maybe on 8mm camera, on a 16mm camera. So it's much more creative, and I wouldn't use it for, let's say, creative projects because it might be odd. But even if you use some of the 35 or even 65, it's going to be more subtle, and still the little touches there is going to bring it closer to a shot on film look. The next tool is called Film Breath, and it's another one of those tools that really makes all the difference when it comes to make film emulation. The film breath is the accidental change in exposure or colors caused by an uneven emulsions during the developments. And as a result, you would see in certain regions of your images, not on the all images, but on the certain regions, almost like it seems to be flickering the exposure or the colors. And when you use this in the profile such as the 35 or the 65, it makes a very subtle thing that makes all the difference between the digital footage and shot on film footage. So I'm going to enable Hide Film Breath, and you won't see anything happens because we're just looking at the post version here. And if I try to play it, it's going to most likely drop frame. So you won't be able to see it, but maybe if I push it to 800mm, you might see the effect better. You can see how it flickers. And look at my scope down there, how it seems to be like jitter. And that's film breath. So when you use this in a more, in a larger profile here, it's going to be much more subtle, but again, makes all of the difference. See how it kind of like slightly flickers? It's a beautiful way of replicating film. And one of the final tools is called Gate Weave. And what Gate Weave does is that it replicates the film strip passing through a projector. And sometimes it moves a little bit out of place. And so that's what Gate Weave does. So I'm going to activate it now. And you can see already how it kind of like zoomed in a little bit on the images, cropped it. And that's used to like make that kind of like jitter effect. So again, if I'm going to play it here, you can see how it seems to be like hovering a little bit, and again, almost like jitters, almost was handheld. So that replicates the film passing through the projector. And like Film Damage and Film Breath, you want to be careful with Gate Weave because these three settings here will really de-hance your footage. That's the idea behind DEHANCER. So they might not be suited for commercial projects, especially if you are using the 8mm or the 16mm profile. Now, if you want a subtle effect of Gate Weave, you can go with the 65, which in my opinion might be subtle enough, to be used in more projects, and it's not as jarring as, let's say, going to 800mm. We also have a vignette tool within DEHANCER'S. Generally, you would use a mask here to make your vignettes, but it's already embedded in DEHANCER'S, and it makes for a very organic vignette. So I'm going to enable it here, and you can see here it's way too dark. So I'm going to increase my exposure about there. And I really like how it kind of centered around my subjects. But now with all of those tools, you can see that somehow they all kind of impact the overall exposure of the film. So I might need to go back again to my expand and go again and see to increase a little bit again. Okay, and same with my black point. So as a final tool, you also have some monitoring tools, so you can check your false colors, your clipping indications. As you can see, if I toggle this on, I'm not clipping anything. And then you have your output here, if you want to kind of use that as a overall presets and you want to change the total impact. Now, I don't really like this. I'd rather change all of those different settings, but it's there if you want it. And you also have a LUT generator here, which allows you to make a LUT from your grade. Now, the LUT won't include the gate weave, the film breadth, the film damage, the bloom and the HALATION. I'm not so sure, but it's going to include like your color head and all of that. So you can make either a monitoring LUT, or if you wish to have a LUT for other softwares or to use for the rest of the timeline if it's something that you want to do. Okay, let's create another clip quickly. So it's the same project here, but we've moved indoor. So again, I'm going to go click here, apply grade, and I have my node 3. DEHANCER is off. I'm going to go to my white balance. I'm going to go to my picker, and I'm going to look for a neutral source and see. So overall, you can see the red channels is larger here. There is more red, so I'm going to go maybe to the wearable. Okay, so it kind of cooled down the images, and I'm going to click back to my, I'm going to see what it says here. See, much better here between the 3 channels. They're much closer from each other. So now I have my white balance, and I'm going to deactivate DEHANCER. Okay, so it makes it again very blue and very desaturated. So we're going to start with our film, which is still 250D. I go to film developer, enable. I'm going to start adding some contrast just slightly. I'm going to increase my gamma. I'm going to add back some saturations. Okay, so you can see already simply with the saturations how you were able to bring that image back to life. Okay, back to DEHANCER. My film developer. Next, I'm going to go to my print. I'm going to enable range limiter, and I'm going to add some more contrast. I'm going to increase slightly the exposure of the print. Maybe I'm going to add some density to my colors. Yes. Next, I'm going to do my expand tool. I'm going to bring back some of that dark I'm losing here. Now I'm going to go to my film compression, enable it. Wonderful, and I'm going to increase. You can see in the window how much I'm gaining again here, and that wall. Okay, wonderful. Now you can see I'm clipping here, and I'm mostly clipping inside that little zone here because I forgot to move that curtain. I'm going to add more contrast. Okay, my black point, I can see I'm losing some, I'm most likely losing some details here in the drawers, but I don't really mind about those. I'm gonna actually reduce a little bit my exposure now. I would create maybe a small mask here. Okay, and maybe now I'm simply gonna increase my gamma just a little bit. See what it does. Yeah, I bring back the definition on the skin tones. Make sure it's not underexposed. Okay, back to DEHANCER. I'm gonna go to my color head, enable. I'm gonna warm it up slightly. I'm gonna compensate with my magenta, keeping an eye on my scope here. Add some cyan, not too much. And I'm going to, oh, I forgot to preserve exposure. I'm gonna warm up those shadows a little bit. I'm going to also warm up the skin tones, but not so much for my midtones. I'm not gonna put anything in the tones of the highlights, and maybe here I'm already a bit too there. Let's try to separate the background from my subject here. Enable it on and off. Great. Now I have my film grain. I'm just gonna still 250D, but maybe here I don't want it to be so. Maybe I'll go here to 65. Yes, halations again. So halation here, you should see a much better example of halations. Go back. Why are you gone now? Wonderful. So here, around the face here, most likely. Let's see what it does. So you can see it warm ups a little bit the skin tones, and if I go all the way to 8 mil, you can see what it does. So here it's too much. Curiously enough, you don't see it around here, and I think it's because here you have the fringing, and so because it's like kind of work on the same region of the images, there was too much fringing here, and it wouldn't be able to be corrected by the software, and because I most likely think you would have some halation here, but maybe not. And then if I go maybe to no ramjet, here you can see exactly the effect it does. So this is way over the top, but you get the idea of what halations does. See here the halo around, add some bloom. I really like what the bloom does, especially on the skin tones. And it kind of fades here the wall. I will leave off those checked, unchecked, and maybe let's see what vignetting does. Again, a bit too much. Okay, and now I think I'm a bit too dark, so I'm going to go to my print, and I can increase a little bit my exposures, and then I'm going to finishing with the expand tool here. Okay, and again here you would select your whole tree, copy, and then maybe here, let's see what it does. And boom, see, most of the work is already done here. So of course I need to deactivate this. I would most likely kind of like make it larger. I have to again retrack it, just so that I keep those skin tones not too dark. Add them back some definition so you can see what it does. Okay, and here if I just uncheck the answer, I can look at my scope and my white balance. I can see how it corrected the images, so I think it's roughly the same here. It hasn't changed from the previous shot, so I'm already done here, boom. These past two sequences were created using the DaVinci Wide Gamut with a CST input and output, but you can use a standard Rec 709 if you want. So first of all, we're going to go back to our project setting, which is Shift 9, color managements, and under timeline color space, we're going to change this to Rec 709. And under output color space, I'm using still the Rec 709A. We've now swapped to Rec 709, so it's going to impact these previous clips here, but just for the sake of the example, I'm on the same timeline. So I'm going to create two more nodes. On this third node here, I'm going to apply the answer. And now here you can see it's going to be a different settings inside the input in the answer. So the source is going to be your camera, so shown on a Sony A7S III. And then the format was S-Log3 and base ISO was most likely 640. Boom. Now if I deactivate the answer here, I'm left with the log. So just with one node, the answer takes care of not only the conversion to Rec 709, and also combine it with the film emulation. So it's a much simpler workflow if you don't want to work with the color space transform. And you also have to keep in mind that the way the answer interprets the log footage from this camera is different from the way DaVinci Resolve interprets the log from this Sony. So you'll get different results depending if you're using the camera profile or if you're using the color space transform from DaVinci Resolve. And from there is the same thing, so you would have your differential here to make sure it's activated, and then all of those tools work the same way that we've just used them just before. But I would still recommend to use maybe a previous node, maybe white balance here. You would have your saturations here, and maybe another like a layer of mask here, the same way we've done with the previous sequence here. And that's about it. As you can see, the answer is a very powerful plugin, especially in Resolve. And what I love about it is that it's not a one-click solution like a lot, because with the answer, you really have to build in your grade. And I love seeing how the image comes alive. You start with your colors and your contrast, then you had the grain, the bloom, and the halations, and all of those different tools that replicate the characteristic of film. All together, they really bring out the shot on film look with your digital footage. And so if you're interested into the answer, I've included a link to the trial versions in the description below. And when you're ready to purchase, you can use my discount code RobinFernStudio for 10% off at checkout, from which I'll get a small commission, which does help the channel. That's for me, guys. Thank you for watching. I hope you got something out of this video. And if you did, please consider liking and subscribing so I can do more of those videos in the future. Bye for now.